Hi, I'm Paul Rice, and today I'm talking with Vladimir Kolak, and we're going to be talking about blockchain. So the way this is going to work is I'm just going to ask some questions about blockchain, and Vlad's going to provide his insight and answer those questions for you today. So let's get into it. So what is blockchain?
So if you look at sort of concept of blockchain, the idea has really existed for a long time. It's a new technology for sure, but really companies and organizations have been tracking transactions for centuries, right? So blockchain is really a way to keep track of store of value or keep track of transactions, but it's done in a different way. Before, it was typically some kind of centralized approach, a database, right? An ERP system. With blockchain, companies are now able to distribute those transactions among different, for example, trading partners. And so as someone is entering a transaction in that distributed database, other parties can actually verify that the transaction is correct and can also store it immediately, automatically in their systems as well. So now there's no single point of failure for data, if you will. And it's done in a modern digital way where all parties present in that blockchain transaction could see it and could actually manipulate it and actually could use it.
Makes sense. So explain to me how blockchain is used.
So today, the reality is it's a very new technology. Most companies are really just piloting, kind of exploring how this technology could change industries. But there's already some examples of it. For example, Walmart is looking at blockchain to track food through their supply chain. So the issue that we have is, if everybody remember the scare of 2006 with spinach having E. coli, all of the spinach was essentially removed from the shelves in the United States because we didn't know where it was coming from, right? And so it took Walmart something like 2 weeks to figure out, as an example, where that came from. And same thing happened to all the other retailers. With blockchain, once it's fully implemented, that could take minutes, right? So it provides easier way to see all of the different transactions throughout the supply chain as product goes from one trading partner to another to another. And this is just one example of blockchain in logistics and supply chain management. But that whole idea could be used in many different industries for many different use cases.
So what are the business benefits?
So if you think about how business is done today, especially, and I'm talking again kind of supply chain management, most of the time what happens is there's data that's being transferred from a trading partner to a trading partner to another trading partner. And each step of the way, there's systems that typically integrate, and often people that have to do data entry and have to manipulate the data. And what happens is essentially it's a duplication of effort where everybody has to do the same thing several times. So with blockchains, if fully implemented, if all the different trading partners are on a blockchain, all of a sudden that really gets automated, right? With coupling of something like IoT, not only we have ability to, for example, track products and really look at provenance, where the product came from, but also we know which conditions that product arrived in. For example, say you're shipping fish from China to United States. Well, how do you know that temperature in that particular freezer didn't go up through some kind of threshold? So with IoT data, we can compile and actually enter on a blockchain so nobody can cheat. Nobody can say, oh no, the temperature was okay and it really wasn't.
Makes sense. So what are the industries you see today utilizing blockchain?
So today there are all kinds of different industries really looking at it heavily. Anything from supply chain management and logistics, those are really important use cases, to even the way capital is being raised. Companies, this is more on the side of cryptocurrencies, but companies can actually raise funding through ICOs, through essentially initial coin offerings. And so it's possible that at some point cryptocurrencies themselves will actually either replace or just at least augment the venture capitalists. Another example is to essentially transfer money, right? So banks today When they do international transfers, it takes days sometimes to settle a transaction, and it's a very expensive process. And so banks are actually looking at blockchain to see how they could streamline that process, make it easier and faster to actually transfer money from one country to another.
So how would you go about implementing a blockchain project?
So first of all, I think there's a lot of hype around the technology. So I don't think companies really need to jump into it unless there's some kind of real business benefit. So the first thing I would do is just look at, well, what are some problems we're trying to solve internally within the company, or maybe even externally with partners, with customers. And if there is a clear use case, then I think the appropriate thing is to just define what that is, define what value will we have. And many companies simply do some kind of pilot project. So they'll start really exploring what it means to get this kind of technology implemented, and what are some pitfalls, and really prove the fact that there could be benefit for those particular use cases.
Makes sense. So what are some legal challenges blockchain presents?
So blockchain itself typically doesn't present a whole lot of legal challenges. However, when companies try to couple it with cryptocurrency, they really need to be careful that they're doing it the right way. There are many startups that basically created cryptocurrencies in the United States, and frankly, SEC looks at those things as investments, right? It's not a currency typically. It looks at, SEC looks at it as some kind of investment or asset. And so, if companies who are actually using cryptocurrencies within their blockchain environment really need to register them with SEC. So that's one challenge. Second is, typically what happens is blockchains are deployed as a consortium among different companies. And in many cases, they're actually competitors with each other. So as they really run the consortium, as they actually are using the technology, they need to make sure that there's no collusion, right? They need to make sure that there's no price fixing, and there's anything that actually could be construed as somebody colluding with one another.
So what exactly is a consortium, and why do you need it?
Good question. So blockchain by its nature is very distributed technology, and the whole idea is to basically have some benefit when multiple parties get together. And so yes, it can be used internally within one company, but often you can just use a centralized database for it, so you really don't need to use a blockchain. And so consortium is essentially a group of companies that get together and decide we'll implement blockchain, and here are the rules, here are how we'll structure smart contracts, and somebody governs that. And typically that's done through some kind of consortium of which the different partners are members.
So let's say I wanted to get started with blockchain. What would I do first?
So obviously we talked a little bit about if it's for business use, which probably is, really understand the use cases and the business model behind it. So I don't advocate looking at the technology first without really understanding the business aspects of this. But say we found a use case, and now we're really trying to think about, how do we technologically do this? The first thing to ask is the use case more for a public blockchain or a permission? And let me explain that. So public blockchain is something like Bitcoin, right? Everybody can use it. There's no permission to where I could use it, you could not. So anybody really can participate in a Bitcoin blockchain, if you will. Same thing happens with other projects like Ethereum, where there's all kinds of different applications, such as betting. People bet with one another, and that could be done in a public way. So if that's the business model, then most likely it's best to look at some kind of public facing blockchain technology. Ethereum is one of those. It's very popular. Companies can actually build applications on top of the Ethereum blockchain. Now, on the other hand, if it's permission, such as this is a supply chain where multiple parties participate, and we really don't want the public to be there, right? These may be 2 or 3 or 10 different companies that are trading partners with one another, then Ethereum by itself is probably not the right choice.
Why is that?
Well, because what happens is everybody can participate in the network. So, and you probably want to exclude some people from it. You don't want any public to see your transactions. Right?
So some of the data is private. You don't want the whole world.
The data would be basically public.
That makes sense.
So that's one of the reasons. And two, this is a little bit more technical, but essentially because it's public, there's this thing called consensus algorithm that allows people essentially not to cheat.
Okay.
And I think people maybe have heard, Bitcoin is slow. It's it takes a lot of CPU power, a lot of energy to actually make sure that transactions go through it, and that's because of security. So permission blockchains don't necessarily need that much security, simply because we kind of know what the parties are. We know it's our trading partners. There's a little bit more trust, maybe not 100% trust,
sure,
but there's a little bit more trust when it comes to trading partners as opposed to public.
Yeah, it's completely anonymous.
Exactly. Okay. So for permission blockchains, there's all kinds of frameworks. Hyperledger Fabric is one of those. In fact, the whole Hyperledger project has all kinds of different implementations of blockchain. There's others like Corda, and there's frameworks popping out all the time. So there really isn't a need to kind of do it from scratch, to become a crypto or like cryptography expert. There's plenty of building blocks now that companies can actually leverage. There's also Ethereum, Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is very similar to what Fabric is trying to do, Hyperledger is trying to do, and it's really Ethereum for private sort of permission blockchains.
What are some of the risks to attempting to adopt blockchain right now?
So one is the technology is very new. If you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin existed for only about 10 years. If you look at something like Ethereum or Hyperledger I mentioned before, they've only been around for 3 years. So it's very, very young, new technology. And so the dangers with it come that basically it's not maybe as mature or robust as some companies need. Other pitfalls are it's not a panacea. So there's a lot of hype in sort of what blockchain does, and blockchain can solve everything, and that's not the case, right? So there needs to be a good use for it, good use case, and companies can spend a lot of money and resources by chasing something that maybe could be served better by simply some kind of centralized system.
So explain to me the difference between Bitcoin and blockchain. Are they the same thing? How does that work?
That's a good question. If you look at what Bitcoin is, most people say it's a cryptocurrency. Others say it's really some kind of store of value or a way to transfer value. Underneath all of it is essentially a way to do it, way to make sure that transactions are secure, make sure that there's no what they call double spend, which is if I send you my Bitcoins and I send the same Bitcoin to someone else, I shouldn't be able to do that, right? So there's some mechanisms that essentially prevent things like double spend. All of those mechanisms underneath are really a blockchain. So the concept really, the technology that powers Bitcoin is blockchain. And then blockchain can be then used all by itself for all kinds of other uses, not just cryptocurrencies, right? So you can do other things with it that have nothing to do with cryptocurrencies, actually.
So if I wanted to learn more about blockchain, what do you recommend that I should go look at to get started?
Sure. So luckily, there's all kinds of resources out there. There's a ton of YouTube videos that really do a great job of explaining what it is better than I could.
Right.
There are all kinds of other resources, like there are Udemy courses for $10 you can find a course that can talk about this really in detail for hours. And there are all kinds of other projects that, documentation for projects one can look at, especially if this is more of a technical person. They can look at Ethereum and their development documentation, but also Hyperledger. They have an amazing documentation around how to use Hyperledger, how to even get started, and how to program and create smart contracts and those kinds of things.
If I was a more business-minded user versus a technical person, would there be a different route I would go to start learning about blockchain?
I think so. I've when I kind of started diving into it, I went to actually a bunch of conferences, and there are people who kind of had the same question: what is this thing? How does it work? How can I use it, and where? Right. So I would definitely encourage. There's all kinds of conferences, universities like University of Texas at Austin had a conference this year. So there's all kinds of other sort of resources that are very much business focused. For example, the one at UT. It was Macomb School of Business, so actually they talked about business implications when it comes to blockchain, and not really as much technology.
And then for the technology aspect, if I'm wanting to get into the actual coding and building of it, what would you recommend there?
If you're deciding to look at something like public blockchain, then I would recommend Ethereum. It's basically one that seems to be the most popular. Their documentation is really good. The language solidity is actually very easy to use. So any developer should be able to pick that up relatively quickly. If permission blockchain is kind of more of an interest, then I would look at something like Hyperledger, and Hyperledger has a great development documentation, and it's it could be programmed with either JavaScript or Golang, Google's Golang. So it's not something that it's something that regular developers could pick up fairly easily.
Sure. So what are smart contracts?
As opposed to dumb contracts?
Yeah.
So when we look at how we sort of do business, right? Typically that's done by having physical document that actually has a contract. I'll maybe do some kind of service for exchange of value, money, right? And those are enforced kind of outside of some kind of technology system, right? If we feel like somebody breached a contract, then we'll start dealing with it. Right? Piece of paper. Now contracts, are digitized now, so you might have a digital representation of it, but it's still just a PDF, right? It doesn't really do anything.
Yeah.
So smart contracts are a little bit different, and in a sense allow different parties to a transaction to have some kind of automatic action. So for example, say I will perform some kind of service for you, and for that service you'll give me some kind of cryptocurrency or even physical fiat currency. If we can programmatically determine that service was done, and we say we both agree that service was done, then we can automatically execute some kind of contract that essentially transfers some value from you to me, right? So it's a way to actually execute real world contracts, but programmatically. So we remove this human element, we remove this sort of even paper-based element from that business transaction.
So any final thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think I would encourage anyone who kind of thinks about business models and doing things differently to look at to see if blockchain would benefit them. It may not. Like I said, there's a ton of hype around this. But at the end of the day, there's a possibility that blockchain could essentially transform many industries, which would be very exciting.
Well, thanks for watching.
Thank you.